Okay, so we had introduced this concept of erosional coastline and depositional coastline with typical features seen like headlands and caves and sea arches and so on the erosional coastline, and spits and tombolos and barrier islands and so on a depositional coast. There is a further classification called Shepherd's classification of coasts. So they are divided into coasts that are shaped by non-marine processes or primary processes, primary coasts, and coasts shaped by marine processes or marine organisms like reefs and so on, and they are secondary coasts. Okay, so here are the table with some examples: land erosion coasts, subaerial depositional coast. So you can have a erosional coast and a depositional coast, and then it can be a primary coast and a secondary coast. So multiple attributes, multiple characteristics. Volcanic coasts, coasts shaped by Earth's movements or plate tectonics, and ice coasts, right? So these are non-marine processes. So you have land erosion coasts like drowned rivers, which we will see in a minute, and in that you get drowned glacial erosion coasts like fjords and troughs. Fjord is a Norwegian word. We'll see what it means. And we just looked at deltas. So this is a non-marine process. You have rivers coming in and defining the coastline. So you have alluvial plains and deltas, slightly different. Moraines and drumlins. Moraine is basically material that's carried by a glacier when it grows. It pushes material ahead of it as it keeps growing on land. That's called moraine. It grinds up things and sometimes just pushes whatever is ahead of it, like rocks and organic matter and so on and so forth. Drumlins, another kind of geologic feature. Wind deposition coasts, so you have dunes like we had seen before. Landslide coasts, lava flows, so you have Hawaii, for example, has a lot of these volcanically defined primary coasts, and you have coasts shaped by Earth's movement, so you will see faults and folds and sedimentary extrusions and mud lumps and salt domes and so on. In the secondary coasts, main thing to remember is they are shaped by marine processes or marine life forms. So wave erosion, marine process. So you have a coast that's been straightened by the waves. Irregular coasts. Barrier coasts we already saw, so those are marine deposition coasts. So you had here subaerial deposition, so sand can be carried by air and deposited and can define the coastline. So it's a non-marine process. Sand is also formed on land, right? So cusped forelands, beach plains, mudflats, salt marshes, and so on. Coral reef and algae, obviously. There are many coasts which have dead coral reefs and dead algae, dead oyster reefs. Mangrove coasts. They are secondary coasts. Marsh grass, serpulid reefs, and so on and so forth. Again, remember the concepts of a primary coast shaped by non-marine processes, and secondary coasts shaped by marine processes or marine biological activities like reefs, coral reefs, and oyster reefs, and so on. So we already saw that sand colors say something. That's a monsoonal kind of flow forming this dark black sand, and then you have white sand, which depends on the material that's being ground up and being brought to the beach. You have a greenish or reddish, sometimes depends on whether you have high what is the mineral content? Is it iron or is it something else that gives you a green color? So here you have sea arches and sea stacks. These are erosional coasts, and they are primarily formed by marine processes so they are secondary coasts. And you have erosional features here again. So erosion here is caused by waveforms from the ocean and so on. These are obviously depositional features, marine processes, so they are depositional secondary coasts. Again, marine waves are forming these tombolos and spits and so on. There are these canyons being formed by the flow of sediment. Remember we said there are rip currents formed by pressure gradient by the longshore currents. We will see the longshore currents that run right down the Pacific and Atlantic coast because of where the energy is generated and so on. And there are tectonically formed canyon-like features. So Monterey Canyon here off California, for example, is pretty much as big as or even bigger than the Grand Canyon, except it's underwater. And it has a waterfall of sand. So much sand flows into it that it has a waterfall. Okay, so that's kind of a coastline formed by flow from the flow of sand by the ocean. So here is it a primary coast or a secondary coast? It's a primary coast because it's formed by glaciers, and this is a fjord. So the difference between a river cut valley and a fjord is that the glaciers form the fjords, and they tend to be U-shaped because they carve. As the ice freezes, they keep they can even break rocks, right? So they keep forming this U-shaped, whereas a river tends to have a more of a V-shaped. So here is a fjord that has been filled by rivers, and here is a primarily ocean process, so it's a secondary coast. It's a biological activity, it's a reef, and here is a volcanically formed coastline, and so on. So obviously you can be comfortable enough to identify a coastline by looking at the image and decide whether it's a erosional coast or a depositional coast, whether it's a primary coast or a secondary coast, and so on. Just a way to classify coastlines, right? Interesting images, but there is a lot of information in them as well. And next time you show it to grandma, you can impress her again with this knowledge you just acquired.